How have you been? I see you've had a busy morning today.
Actually, it has been a little busy. No, all good, all good. Hey, look, every opportunity, every change is an opportunity, rather. What we're all going through is, by most definitions, some of the biggest changes that the world has seen since the world wars, right? And of course, it's uncomfortable and it's caused a lot of pain and will continue to do that. But I think what distinguishes, the leaders that thrive and come out of, these situations in a much more positive trajectory, is the ability to also figure out how to, serve their clients and, serve their companies and figure out how to creatively, just keep adding value. And I think, to kind of tie that to what's happening in my area, after the first month or so where, everybody was just kind of trying to recover from the shock of all of this, there's a whole bunch of companies and leaders who have started to kind of get past that and think about what's next. And a lot of what's next is, how do we consolidate the gains in productivity and digital transformation, whether it is remote working or, less use of facilities or the enforced use of digitalization, and let's make that come true. And I think that's a lot of what I do these days. I just happen to do it remotely rather than, fly all over the world. But, I think it's great. We're already in that new world as a result of this.
Yeah. And I see the urgency for the expertise that you provide is even more these days. So that sort of brings me to the first question, Tony. What sort of conversations are you personally having with your clients at Transformant or otherwise, specifically since COVID?
So it is all about two things. One is, where are we in the entire change cycle? And then, what is it that people can do right now, right? In whatever shape or form, I think it all kind of comes down to those two. So firstly, where are we in the change cycle? From all of the historical data that we have on economic crisis, you can see very, very clear patterns. So whether it is the ASEAN economic crisis or China before that, or Russia in 1990, or even the global economic crisis of 2008. Most of these crises go through four stages. One is the immediate trigger that caused it. In this case, it was a pandemic. But you have the scramble stage where people all kind of get together and say, okay, how do we cope? People work from home. Does everybody have connections, laptops, all that kind of stuff? The second stage is, sustain your business model, which is, can I still ship my product? Can I still run my factories in a new way? But the third, which is still ahead of us, and this is really, some of the stuff that I was talking about where bold change leaders are starting to get in and take a position, is basically trying to figure out, how do I, consolidate my operations? How do I actually get much more efficient to deal with economic crises? And that's really where digital transformation plays, because it is the world's proven strategy at this place. And then the fourth is basically, you were able to kind of convert your business model to whatever that enforced new normal is, right? So that's the type of conversations on the one side. And then the second is, what do we do now? And a lot of what you do now depends on, the industry and your company's position in the industry. So if your company was cash rich and had a great market leadership position, that's great. Congratulations, because then, you have the bandwidth to essentially invest some of that money in digital transformation. Or on the other hand, if your company was already struggling pre-pandemic and doesn't necessarily have market leadership position, the strategy is basically save to reinvest. So figure out how to creatively, cut in other areas and very, very selectively invest that in digital transformation. And so that's the second nature of conversations. But Let's be very clear. Digital transformation has not been postponed as a result of the pandemic. It has actually been accelerated. The question is, again, understanding your specific situation and figuring out how to accelerate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony. And as we talk to our viewers here, if you have specific questions related to your organization or your own needs, please feel free to type your question in the chat box. So Tony, about that second group of companies, which are rather in the more nascent stages of technology adoption, or who don't have the financial or whatever else it is, the resources needed to invest, what are some things that they can take care of? What are some things that they can leverage or they need to be aware of?
Yeah. So actually, in many ways, they may be at a strategic advantage. We have to kind of remind ourselves, having worked at large companies, that, the good thing and the bad thing in many of these companies is that we have large, expensive IT foundations, whether it's SAP or, all that kind of stuff, right? Whereas digitally native companies, use very different transactional systems and ways of working and, so on and so forth, right? So where companies are in the nascent stages of digital transformation, so, I call those foundation or beginning, the advantage that they have is that they can be very, very clear in their digital strategy on, what are their digital leverage points. Digital leverage points are basically looking at your business model and trying to figure out where can digital technology give you the most advantage. So for example, Amazon's website is known, and most people think that Amazon's website may be a leverage point. It is, but actually it's their supply chain and their physical assets and the immense automation of those. That's 100 times a bigger leverage point. This is one of the reasons why larger companies, including Walmart in the US, would struggle in the online game, because the ability or inability to invest and mimic that is going to be very difficult. So that's what I mean by leverage point. So for companies that are in the earlier stages, I think they basically have to work off of their business strategy. They have to understand what their business models are, and they have to translate that into digital leverage points, and then very selectively focus more of their investments in that direction.
Can you give us any examples from any of the recent client experiences you've had?
Yeah, so I can't tell you names of clients, but I can certainly give you lots of examples. And actually, let me give you, interestingly, let me give you examples that are not necessarily billion-dollar companies. So, I work with a company that's a distributor of like snacks, chips, and all that kind of stuff, right? And they're relatively small in the US, by the way, and they're relatively small. I mean, they just do work in a few states, right? So you kind of think about them and running a distributor operation of a few people, and it doesn't seem like, okay, what can you do? You basically deal with trucks and orders and all that kind of stuff. But here's what I mean. So they have the advantage of them being the disruptors, right? So instead of then building the infrastructure for supply chain and vans and stuff like that, we're looking at digital technologies where a combination of Uberization of delivery and technology, using even the cell phones of those drivers, can give them more real-time information and much more analytics capabilities than you might have in large companies. So that's an example of size almost doesn't matter. It's the ability to be strategic.
Wow, that is quite an interesting example. Thank you for sharing that, Tony. In your book, you talk about not all CEOs/leaders/managers being tech savvy. And it's actually critical to have leadership skin in the game with respect to digital transformation, which tends to get delegated. I find it very relevant, this particular topic, as I was reading it, and something that doesn't get talked about much, right? So can you share a little bit about your perspective there with our audience here?
Yeah. It's true. I mean, senior leadership, and by the way, even boards of directors, we have a technology gap, right? A technical capability gap. In fact, I think McKinsey had done a survey that said, only about 20% of the companies in the US have even a person in the board that's just one person that's tech savvy. And then only 5% of all of the boards in the US have adequate technical skills. Now, the reason why, whether it's boards or CEOs or leaders, why that becomes critical is, you have to understand that we're in the midst of an industrial revolution, right? This one caused by digital technologies, or to take a parallel, which is what I do in my book. If you went back to the second industrial revolution and, the overtaking of the horse carriage industry by the motor cars, if all of the board of directors at that time, knew horses and nobody really recognized what, internal combustion engines could do, I mean, how do you really set strategy? And so I think, we all understand that. And by the way, best of all, I think leaders, CEOs, board members, they understand that this is a necessity. The question then becomes, what do you do about it? And there are a few things that I think are incredibly important. As individuals, I think we as leaders need to understand that we don't need to become technology experts or tech savvy. All we need to do is understand how technology is disrupting our industry, right? So if you happen to work in the, let's say, machine tools business, you don't need to understand, the latest digital technologies, on artificial intelligence and what's happening on aerospace or whatever it is. But you have to understand how digital technologies is going to change forever machine tooling in the future, including, additive manufacturing and all that kind of stuff. So, and that's a much more manageable challenge for these leaders. The second thing that they need to understand is that the difference in leadership between an industrial revolution period and normal periods is that during industrial revolution periods, you need to be much more hands-on, because the transition is bigger. You're going to have a bigger change resistance within your organization. And so being a sponsor of change is not sufficient. You have to be hands-on in the change. And those are just two relatively simple tips, but I think they're very, very important in the context of our era.
Thank you. And, I've read your book, and it covers a lot more of these ideas and stories or insights that can help all of us, also leaders, in that digital transformation. So I am now curious about if you can share a personal story from probably your P&G days that I think we talked about it, that sub-Saharan Africa story where, there was digitization amidst uncertainty, low budgets, etc.
Yeah. Happy to talk about that. It's also a good example, Mira, to your earlier question about, what do you do if you're just beginning in the early stages of transformation? So, a little bit of context for people. This was the time, 2009 through 12, when I was the IT and global business services leader for, at Procter Gamble, what's called Central Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So it's 110 countries all the way from, like Russia to, Africa, Middle East, Eastern Europe, right? So the difference in business models between, that region and, let's say Western Europe or the US is basically in the shape of the trade, right? So you have not many mega stores, not many, malls and large stores, grocery stores, but as you all know, probably, you have these mom and pop stores, which are served through distributors. So the whole selling model is different. Instead of selling to a Walmart, you're selling to distributors who in turn then may sometimes sell to, sub-distributors, and then eventually to quite literally millions of these stores, right? Now, from a technology and an information standpoint, that distinction in selling models is very different, is because your information as a company probably ends when you sell the product to a distributor. And then what happens 2 layers down is an issue. And so you get constantly surprised on, oh, wait a minute, I thought I had a good month of sales, and then now my pipeline inventory suddenly went up next month, and then I'm not selling anymore. So what the hell's happening? So the challenge I took on was to basically say, hey, I want to have the same level of visibility down the line, down to the individual stores, millions of stores in sub-Saharan Africa that I have in the US, right? And then, of course, the question becomes, how on earth are you going to do that? Firstly, those are not direct customers. They are customers of customers of customers. And then secondly, you don't have the same kind of money in sub-Saharan Africa that you have in the US to go build those solutions. But again, think differently. So we basically started by being extremely clear on the few metrics, just 6 metrics that we wanted to roll out. We were very clear about the standards of that information. And then we just use different technology. Cell phones are everywhere. And if all you want is 6 pieces of information, and you can have sales reps or store owners basically send that quite literally in real time up the chain, then you have that same visibility. And as a result, in a couple of years, Bob McDonald, who was a CEO of P&G at the time, said, we have more visibility in what's happening to these small stores in Africa than we have to stores in the US. So,
wow.
That's an example of, I think, how digital can change the game.
Yeah. And it needs somebody as visionary as you to actually bring in those thoughts and ideas, and of course your team as well, and bring it to life.
No, that's embarrassing. I think, honestly, it's nothing special. I think it's more the realization that it's not difficult. I think you basically have to challenge yourself to reinvent models, to figure out how to do it differently. Because I think if we had taken the old path of, okay, let's put in, order shipping and billing systems across, 1 million retailers using the standard technology, we'd never have been able to do any of that.
Oh yeah, that's creative and being, on your toes thinking, on your feet thinking. So Tony, I want to take a detour. We've obviously talked a lot about technology. You're passionate about it. I want to know more about the person behind all this digital transformation. What are some of your passions outside of digital transformation?
Oh my God. So I'm a restless person. I probably, have some form of ADHD or something like that. But I just like to learn and do different things. Whether that's, pre-pandemic, whether that's travel. My family and I are similar, so we like to travel to different places. I think we had done about 35 different countries as a family before coming to a grinding halt, I guess, these days. But in addition to that, I love doing things with my hands, whether it is, building out our basement, or I've even tried some mechanical stuff, rebuilding engines, that kind of stuff, or even playing around with, these days in the pandemic era, growing stuff in our garden. Again, I think there's something about doing things with your own hands that's really fulfilling.
Amazing. And what's one challenge that you're looking forward to conquering next, professionally or personally? One opportunity or challenge, whatever you want to call it.
Well, I think personally, I just like to learn a lot more about, how technology can start to make a difference in the nonprofit sector. I think there is so much opportunity on many of the challenges that the world faces. It's not just environment, which is, by itself a really, really big challenge. And I'm on a couple of boards that help us do that. But, the more I start to understand the issues of inequality, whether it's income or even race and all that kind of stuff, I think technology has a big role to play there. Would love to do more of that.
Okay, lovely. All the best, and we're looking forward to seeing your energy there. We're nearing wrap up. We'll go to Q&A shortly. Is there one thing that, assuming our audience is in the tech, has interest in digital transformations and technology adoption, what's one thing you would want them to take away from this conversation, or something probably you've not said so far? One thing.
Yeah, I alluded to it, but I think this is important. I want to go back to where I started, which is it doesn't matter if you're in the technology space or not. You have to realize that, we're in the midst of an industrial revolution, and this is the time of incredible opportunities, right? And the if you kind of look back at history, at all of the industrial revolution eras, it wasn't necessarily all of the people that invented the technology that became rich or successful. It was the people that figured out how to apply it to real life situations that essentially made the biggest impact. And that's all about mindset. It's all about, understanding that, not all change is bad, that it's up to you to come out with how to make this positive, and to make this a winning proposition for yourself personally and your organizations and your people and stuff like that. So I just want to kind of highlight that, because I think, a lot of the conversations on digital transformation, and probably appropriately, focus on the digital part of that, the technology, the AI, and all of the other stuff, right? I don't think there's enough emphasis on the bigger issue, which is transformation and the people and the mindsets and how you approach that. And that's really what I want people to kind of invest their internal mind space on.
Oh, I love that, especially as a coach. Mindset and looking at opportunity is something I'm passionate about. So glad we have some common ground there as well.
That's good.